Hi, I'm Nathan, and today we're going to be discussing the history behind some of the classes for my game Soul. If you go to our website, soulrpg.com, you'll see a tab called Patch History. It entails the history of the game's development. I'm going to be going through and talking about some of the changes that we made to the classes in patch 1.2. We'll be discussing the reasons behind these changes, and whether I agree with them or not, knowing what I do now. We'll be looking at these changes through the lens of the design philosophy we outlined in the last video. If you haven't watched it yet, here's what you need to know. The mechanics in Soul should be focused on the narrative, and should be kept as simple as possible while allowing for diverse gameplay. I won't be going through everything in this patch, as Soul has a lot of classes, and there were changes to almost all of them. However, I will be at least going through the important stuff. So, to start with the most important part, what even are the classes in Soul? Well, infantry, heavy weapons, SEAL, knight, medic, officer, engineer, doctor, psychologist, diplomat, merchant, explorer, bounty hunter, nomad, bartender, DJ, pirate, assassin, mercenary, thief, and mad scientist. Dimension Soul has a lot of classes? Well, it does. 21 in fact. And while that may be ridiculous, I actually think it's a good thing, and it gives the game a bit of a unique personality. Alright, let's actually take a look at these patch notes and see what we can learn. The first patch note is we're going to be adding another class, the computer specialist. Okay, yeah, I know, I have a problem, I get it, okay? Jeez. But we're actually just going to talk about this one later, as I want to talk about some of the other changes first. The second one is the mercenary and infantry classes were combined and renamed as the Marine. See, I can get rid of classes too. Okay, enough joking around. Let's talk about why these classes were merged. First off, currently classes in Soul only have 5 different abilities, and a player can only pick from 3 of them. The mercenary and infantry both shared 3 abilities in their kit. Not to mention 2 of the abilities the mercenary class had was from the assassin and bounty hunter classes. Needless to say, there was a little too much crossover. So why were these classes even created in the first place? Well, the original idea for Soul was to have classes based on different factions. Infantry was supposed to be part of the Marine Forces of the United Confederation of Soul, or UCS for short, while the mercenary belonged to the Outlaw faction. While I do think the idea was interesting, it was also restricting. If a player wanted to be part of the UCS, they wouldn't be allowed to pick the mercenary, even if it fit their character. I think a better way to implement this would be to make factions separate cards that give the character passive bonuses, allowing for classes to be picked independently of factions. That aside, if classes in Soul are so abundant with few abilities, they should at least be unique. Classes should realistically be sharing as few abilities as possible if the game continues to only have 5 cards per class. Lastly, the archetype of a Space Marine is much more distinct than a class just called Infantry or Mercenary. While Infantry is cool, it's not very thematic. Mercenary, on the other hand, could potentially be turned into something else, but I feel like it also shares a little too many similarities with the Bounty Hunter. Among the changes in this patch were alterations to concentration costs for a bunch of different classes. What is concentration, you ask? Well, it's our stat to keep track of the number of abilities a character can use. Think of it like a mana system, but not for magic. The changes that were made to the classes were mostly reductions in cost, which I think was a good step. Abilities are what make a character feel unique. Being able to use them more frequently really allows the class to shine. Without them, any character is just a guy with a gun, or sword, or bow, or whatever. While this was a good change, the concentration system itself doesn't fit what I want with a game going forward. A player generally had between 10 and 20 concentration, while most abilities on average cost about 6 concentration. It also only increased 1 per turn. This basically means a player could only use 2 to 3 abilities per combat. In theory, this was fine, but typically it meant the player would try to conserve their concentration using only 1 ability, and then using their weapon the rest of the fight. Eventually, we made a resting and regen rule, allowing the GM to grant concentration to a player if they rested after combat. But this just ended up feeling more like a band-aid, while the system really needed to be reworked entirely. While some games may be okay with only a few abilities per combat, or even per session, I'm looking for something more exciting. So this is something that has to be addressed in future versions of the game. The Marine and Heavy Weapons class gain double damage abilities. Truthfully, I'm not sure if this is a good choice or not. In a way, double damage does follow my design philosophy. Well, it is more math. It is easy math. Most people can quickly multiply by 2. The game isn't bogged down while providing a very impactful ability. The biggest problem I have with double damage is that most of the time it ends up taking best in slot, as it is very powerful, having players take it over roleplay-centric abilities or something that adds utility. However, if I'm looking for a more role-playing, double damage doesn't really mean anything in a thematic sense. Let's take a look at the Marine's Adrenaline ability to see how we can change it to fit the new design philosophy. Adrenaline. It's a passive, meaning it is always in effect and does not require concentration. Every third attack does double damage. Okay, so let's first understand the narrative implication of this ability. The initial inspiration for this was the Marine from StarCraft and their ability to use stim packs. However, this changed quickly into something more resembling a person's ability to fight better when they have adrenaline pumping through their veins. So, how do you make an attack more roleplay focused? Well, it's difficult, and to be honest, it's probably the biggest struggle I've had making this game. But let's give it a shot. The simplest thing would be to change the word from attack to action. This means that every time a character uses any action, attack, or otherwise, it would give them double damage. But like we said, the double damage is still a problem. Perhaps the best thing to do would be make it something like the next ability does not require concentration. While it might not make it a roleplay ability itself, it does allow for the player to use a roleplay action along with their combat ones. What if instead we concede that this shouldn't be a roleplay based ability, and that should just be an attack that feels cool and narrative? As double damage doesn't really have any narrative impact. What is the Marine doing? Shooting its bullets harder? Okay, maybe it would be more like shooting it accurately, but it doesn't really seem to fit the ability name. What if instead they can attack twice instead of dealing double damage? It fits the name a little better, and it accomplishes the same thing while also providing more utility. I've also been toying with the idea that every combat ability also comes with a roleplay based one. For instance, let's say that we leave the ability as is and add something like, additionally, the character can also get tasks done in half the time, or something along those lines. This allows for a simplistic combat with easy math and also add an interesting roleplay application to the ability. Which one of these is the right answer? Well, I'm still trying to figure that out, but let me know what you think is the best option. I would be curious to hear all your opinions. Remember that new class I added, the Computer Specialist? The reason I saved it for the end is because it is the best example of a class that has combat abilities while still being roleplay focused. Granted, it's far from perfect, but it's definitely on the right track. Let's take a look at some of this class's abilities to see what we can learn. Hack allows you to take control of technology. This also deals 1 damage to technology. This one uses a bit of the technique I was talking about earlier, where it has a roleplay and combat-based ability. However, dealing 1 damage is hardly anything and should probably be tweaked. I believe this was due to AI characters being considered technology, and we didn't want a computer specialist completely killing an AI. It would help to elaborate on what takes control of technology actually means, or even what is considered technology in the game. One of the challenges of making a card-based RPG is that there's only so much information you can put on a single card. One of the ideas for fixing this, if I continue to use Tabletop Simulator, is to use item states to allow cards to have multiple pages of information. Lockdown allows you to lock down technology and prevent it from working, stunning it for 1 turn. Targets may roll to resist. Utility, I find, leads itself nicely into roleplay. Preventing a character from moving or taking actions can both be used while in combat or while taking part in roleplay. The biggest change I would make is to add what someone would need to do to resist this ability, along with how long it lasts. I may also change this from stunning a target to only preventing the character from taking actions or movements, as losing your turn completely generally isn't very fun. Insight allows you to search and identify the weakness, stats, and abilities of a target. For this one, I feel as if it needs some rewording based on how the game functions. For one, identifying a weakness doesn't really mean anything in context of the game. Characters in Soul don't really have any weaknesses, so adding that as part of the text didn't really make sense. Secondly, knowing a character's stats wasn't particularly useful in this version of the game, and we'll talk a bit about that in the next ability we go over. Knowing a target's ability was the most useful, so I think if reworking this, I would lean more into that aspect. However, if we're looking to make it more roleplay related, it could also give personal information. like a character's backstory or key information that the players may need to know, like codes to a safe or people that the character has been in contact with. Then potentially renaming the ability to something like phishing to fit the hacking theme. Software update. Allows you to imbue +5 of any of the core stats, strength, intelligence, agility, endurance, into a technology-based item. This persists until you select a new piece of technology to update. This one was admittedly a little weird. It's a little convoluted that it's applied to an item. Additionally, it adds to the core stats, which in most cases doesn't do a whole lot, while adding a lot of thinking to figure out how it actually affects your character. To put this in context, for every 10 strength a melee character would get, it's +1 damage. For every 5 points of agility, a player would gain +1 hit chance. For every 10 points of intelligence, a player would gain 1 concentration. And for every 5 points of endurance, a player would gain 1 shield, which is basically just a temporary hit point. So almost half the time this ability is worthless unless your player was 5 points away from a strength or intelligence boost. I've actually already fixed this card in a later patch by changing it so that instead it buffs all the stats of an item card by 1. I find this much more impactful, along with it making more sense in narrative. And last but not least, Echo. Allows you to make a target repeat their last action. This one is a ton of fun and can be used in all sorts of situations. You could do something as simple as make a player attack an enemy for a second time, or as devious as make a client pay you twice for a mission you just accomplished. Like most of these, I would probably clarify some of the wording, but otherwise I don't think I would change much on this one. Well, I think that's all the information I'm going to try to cram into one video. There's plenty of other small changes that were made in this patch, but I think I covered the important ones. If you want to learn more about Soul, you can check out our website at soulrpg.com. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.